Fraction practice number 1. So in this video we are going to do 5 of the 10 problems that are on the companion assignment. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do it, but we are going to focus primarily on finding the common denominator without using our fraction blocks or our pictures. Because a lot of the problems we're going to look at on this assignment, you cannot actually use the fraction blocks or the pictures to find your common denominator. So number 1 is 1/4 plus 1/2. Now, one strategy that you can always use, and I'm going to use this on every one of the problems that we do, is that to find a common denominator, I can always multiply the two denominators together. All right, so if I multiply 1/4 by 2, then I'm going to end up with a fraction with an 8 in the denominator. If I multiply 1/2 times 4, I'm going to end up with a fraction in the denominator. So in both of these cases, for 1/2 and 1/4, if I'm trying to come up with equivalents for the two of them with the same denominator, one option is to multiply the two denominators by one another. Then, though, we're left with, what about the numerators? What do they change into for my new fractions? All right, so let's look back and we'll start with the 1/4. Now, because I multiplied the bottom number, the denominator, by 2, I am now going to multiply the numerator by the same number. So I end up with 2/8. All right, we're going to come back to that in just a second. So for my second fraction, for 1/2, I multiplied the denominator by 4, so I must now also multiply the numerator by 4. And so my equivalent is 4/8. So if I'm looking at this, 1/2 is equivalent to 4/8, and 1/4 is equivalent to 2/8. So I'm left with 2/8 plus 4/8 as my new problem. So off to the side here, I'm going to rewrite this as 2/8 plus 4/8, which is going to give me 6/8. Now, I can simplify or reduce or find the simplest equivalent to this. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and then we're going to come back and talk about this just a little bit more so we're clear on what's going on. So 6/8, the simplest equivalent would be 3/4. And I do that by dividing both top and bottom by 2. Okay. Now, let's talk about changing these fractions to equivalents. So right here I've changed 1/4 to 2/8. Right here I've changed 1/2 to 4/8. And the way I did that was I multiplied both the top and the bottom, the denominator and the numerator, in this case by 4, in this case by 2. In this case I divided both the denominator and the numerator by 2. Now what I want you to notice with each of these is that whatever I did to the denominator, I also had to do to the numerator. So ultimately I'm multiplying, in this case by 4/4, in this case I'm multiplying by 2/2, and in this case I'm dividing by 2/2. Well, 2/2, that's the equivalent of 1/2. And 4/4 is the equivalent of 1/2. Well, if I multiply anything in the universe by 1, my answer is going to be whatever that anything was. So I haven't changed the value of these fractions. I've just found an equivalent that I can then use to add or subtract with. And I know that's a lot, and that's a lot of mess on the screen. So we're going to keep talking about this, and I'm going to go through these relatively slowly. All right, let's go on to number 2. So number 2 is 1/2 plus 2/3. All right, so once again, I cannot add these fractions as they are. I have to come up with a common denominator. The easiest way for me to do that is to simply multiply the two denominators. So I'm going to multiply my 2 by 3 to give me a fraction with a 6 as a denominator. And I'm going to multiply my 3 by 2 to also get another fraction with a denominator of 6. And then I have to figure out, okay, what do I do with my numerators? Well, once again, because I multiplied the bottom by a certain number, I must now multiply the top by the same number. So whatever I multiply my denominator by, I must also multiply my numerator by. So for my 1/2, I multiplied 2 times 3, therefore I must multiply my 1 times 3. So 1 times 3 gives me 3. And so my new fraction is 3/6, which is equivalent to 1/2. For my 2/3, since I multiplied my 3, my denominator, by 2, I must also multiply my 2, my numerator, by 2. 2 times 2 gives me 4. So my equivalent fraction for 2/3 is 4/6. Now I have two fractions with the same denominator, and I can now add them. So I'm left with 3/6 plus 4/6. I add my numerators to give me 7. My denominators don't change. And so my answer is 7/6. Now this is an improper fraction. I need to rewrite it as a mixed number. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull as many 6's out of my numerator as I can. Well, in this case, I can only pull 1. So that gives me 1 whole, and then there's 1 left over because 7 minus 6 is 1. And I'm left with 1 1/6. Okay, let's go on to number 3. Number 3 is 1/5 plus 2/4. And once again, I cannot add these as they are because the denominators are different. So I've got to come up with a common denominator. And so I'm going to multiply my 1/5 fraction. I'm going to multiply my denominator by 4 because that's my other denominator. And for my 2/4, I'm going to multiply that by 5 because that's my other denominator, or my other fraction. So in both cases, I'm going to end up with a denominator of 20. For my numerators, I have to multiply by something. Remember, I must multiply whatever I multiplied my denominator by. I must multiply the numerator by the same number. So in this case, it's a 4. 4 times 1 is 4. For this fraction, multiply the denominator by 5. Therefore, I must multiply the numerator by 5. 2 times 5 gives me 10. So my two new fractions are 4/20 and 10/20. 1/5 is equivalent to 4/20. I have not changed the value, just changed the fraction so that I can add it. Same for 2/4. 10/20 is equivalent to 2/4. And now I'm left with 4/20 plus 10/20. I add my numerators. 4 plus 10 is 14 over 20. My denominator stays the same. Now, this 14/20 is not in its simplest form. I can simplify it. I can reduce it. I can find a simpler equivalent. Because both numbers are even, I know I can divide both by 2, top and bottom again, and I'm left with 7 over 10 as my final answer. All right, let's go on to number 4. Number 4 is 3/10 plus 1/3. Cannot add these because they have unlike denominators. So I need to find equivalents for both. For my 3/10, I need to multiply both the top and the bottom, the numerator and the denominator, by 3, because that's my other denominator. That's going to give me 9 over 30. And then for my 1/3, I need to multiply both my numerator and my denominator by 10, because that's my other denominator, giving me 10/30. So now I have two fractions, both with denominators of 30. So now I can add them. 3/10, the equivalent fraction is 9 over 30. 1/3, the equivalent fraction is 10 over 30. So 9 over 30 plus 10 over 30 gives me 19 over 30. Number 5. Number 5 is 2/3 plus 9/10. Cannot add these because their denominators are unlike. Therefore, I have to change both and find equivalent fractions. For my 2/3 fraction, I'm going to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by 10 because that's my other denominator. That will give me 20/30. For my 9/10, I'm going to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by 3, giving me 27/30. So now I have two equivalent fractions, one equivalent for 2/3, one equivalent for 9/10, both with denominators of 30, and now I can complete my addition problem. So 20/30 plus 27/30 is going to give me 47/30. However, this is an improper fraction, so I have to convert it to a mixed number. So I need to pull out as many 30s as I can out of my numerator. All right, so 47 minus 30 is going to give me 17. So this was one whole I was able to pull out. So my final answer will be one whole and 17/30.